Here is something I find really strange about the AI disruption conversation. Most of the professionals I speak with who are most unsettled by it, they still have their jobs. They still have their skills, and they still have their income. And yet, something feels destabilized in a way that no amount of upskilling seems to address. And the question I continue to ask myself is, why? Why does AI disruption feel existential to midlife professionals when, objectively, most of them are still standing? And I think the answer is that what's being threatened is not primarily their livelihood. It has to do with their identity. The expertise, the title, the institutional role, these aren't just job descriptions for someone who has spent 20 years building a career. Actually, they are the answer to the question, who are you? And when AI starts to erode the functional weight of that answer, the ground shifts in a way that no new certification or LinkedIn refresh can fix. Now, what Carl Jung understood, and what most of the AI discussions are missing entirely, is that this kind of identity disruption is not a crisis to be managed. It's a process to be understood. And the name Carl Jung gave this process was individuation. Now, the argument I want to make here is that individuation and AI disruption are not coincidental. AI is functioning right now as an external catalyst for the internal process the second half of life has always demanded. And if that's true, if Jung mapped this territory a century before the algorithm existed, then the question isn't, how do I stay relevant? The question you should ask yourself is, who am I when the persona is no longer sufficient? Jung introduced the concept of the persona as the mask we wear in our professional and also in our social life. And the word itself comes from Latin for the masks that were worn in Greek theater. It's a symbol for the face an actor presents to the audience. And Jung was very precise about this. The persona is not something pathological. It is necessary to our lives. Actually, you cannot function in the professional world without having one. The lawyer performs legal authority, the director performs strategic confidence, and the consultant performs expertise. These are real functions and the persona serves them well. The only problem with that is what happens when the persona is mistaken for the self, for who we really are. When the professional mask becomes so fused with identity that the person can no longer distinguish between who they are and what they perform. And for professionals in their 40s and 50s, this fusion has typically been building for 15 to 25 years, because the career has been the primary site of identity construction. And for a long time, that has been sufficient. Our job role provided enough structure, enough external validation, and enough answer to the question, who are you? That the deeper question never had to be asked. But now, AI begins to erode the functional value of that performance. Not all at once, but slowly and steadily and in ways that are hard to argue with. Our expertise that took a decade to build can now be approximated in a few seconds. The analytical work that justified the senior title, it's increasingly automated. And the institutional role that conferred identity is being restructured around tools that don't require the same human inputs. And suddenly, our persona cracks. In the people I work with, this moment rarely announces itself as a philosophical crisis. It shows up more like a low-grade restlessness, a latent sense that the work that used to feel meaningful has become hollow. And they have difficulties articulating what exactly they are afraid of losing, because it's actually not their job. It is the self they build around the job. But Jung said this is inevitable. He said it's necessary. And he called it the beginning of individuation, and not its obstacle. The persona collapse is not the problem. It's actually your doorway. Now let's try to understand better what individuation actually is. Because individuation is one of those words that gets used loosely. So I want to be precise about what Jung actually meant. Because it's all about precision here. So individuation is not self-improvement. It is not becoming a better version of your professional self. And it is also not optimizing your strengths or working on your weaknesses. Those are more like ego projects. And the ego, in Jungian terms, is only a small part of the psyche. But individuation is actually a lifelong process by which a person becomes psychologically whole. It is the movement toward what Jung called the self. Not the ego, not the persona, but the totality of your psyche. And that includes everything that had been suppressed, denied or projected, or simply never developed. The shadow, the unlived life, the parts of yourself that didn't fit the professional mask and so were quietly set aside. And Jung was also very clear that this process belongs specifically to the second half of life. Because the first half of life, it has its own legitimate task. And in this phase, developing the persona or the ego actually makes sense. For establishing your identity, for building competence, and for creating your place in the world. And the persona is the right tool for that. But the second half of life has a different meaning and a different end. And the person who tries to continue the first half project into the second half, who doubles down on persona construction when the psyche is calling for something else, is, in Jung's view, working against their own development. And this is why Jung midlife transformation, the AI age, is not a metaphor. It's a structural description of what is actually happening. Because the midlife professional facing AI disruption is not just facing an economic challenge. They are facing the second half of life's demand. The demand to stop identifying with the mask and begin the harder, slower, irreducibly human work of becoming whole. A few months ago, I did a 12-day fast. No food, just water and extended solitude. And I don't want to recommend this here as a practice, but what it made clear to me is something Jung describes theoretically. When you strip away the structures that normally organize your sense of self, the routine, the role, the productivity, what remains is not nothing. It is something older and less legible, something the persona had been covering. And that experience gave me a sense of what individuation is pointing at that no amount of reading had quite delivered. And AI disruption is doing something structurally similar to midlife professionals, involuntarily and at scale. It is removing the scaffolding. And what that reveals is not absence. It is the question the second half of life was always going to ask. And here is what I find most significant about that. AI cannot do that work. Not because it lacks processing power, but because individuation is not a problem to be solved. It is a process to be lived, and it requires confronting the shadow, your shadow, the parts of yourself you have avoided. And it requires integrating the unlived life, the capacities and values sacrificed for the career. It requires also a relationship with your unconscious that unfolds over years, and not in a few seconds or minutes. Individuation is by definition the one process that cannot be outsourced or automated or even approximated. And that is not consolation. This is a philosophical argument. And the point I want to make is that individuation is your competitive advantage in the AI age precisely because it is the one thing AI structurally cannot replicate. Now, Nietzsche arrived at something similar from a completely different direction. He said, "Werde der du bist." Become who you are. And that sounds simple, right? Well, of course I am who I am. Who else would I be? But it is not. Because Nietzsche meant something very precise. He meant that the self is not a given, but it's actually an achievement. It's hard work to get there. And that most people live their entire lives performing the values of the herd and not their own. The inherited expectations, the social scripts, the external definitions of success, without ever asking whether those values are actually theirs. And in Zarathustra, he called the person who has fully surrendered this question the last man. The last man is comfortable, the last man has security, the last man has optimized for survival and social approval. And in doing so, has evacuated the possibility of genuine self-creation. So what Nietzsche called the herd, we could call today the algorithm. And the last man in 2026 looks like this. a senior professional, 15 years into a career that no longer feels like theirs, spending their evenings on LinkedIn, optimizing their personal brand for an audience of recruiters, reshaping their identity around whatever the market currently rewards, and calling that adaptability. But actually, it's not adaptability. It is the oldest form of self-abandonment, running on a new software. Because the professional who responds to AI disruption by asking, what does the market want from me now, who calibrates their identity entirely around external demand, is performing the last man's move. They're outsourcing the question of who they are to a system that has no interest in the answer. And the individuation AI disruption competitive advantage argument rests precisely here. Not because individuation makes you more productive, but because it makes you irreplaceable in the only sense that actually matters. You become someone who cannot be approximated, because you have done the work of becoming specifically, irreducibly yourself. So self-overcoming for Nietzsche is the active refusal of the last man's comfort. It is the willingness to go through the discomfort of genuine self-examination rather than the ease of external validation. And it is, in this sense, the Nietzschean name for what Jung called individuation. The hard, first-person work of becoming who you actually are, rather than who the role required you to be. Now, coming back to Jung, he wrote that the afternoon of life cannot be lived according to the program of the morning. And he meant this structurally, because the tasks are different. And also the orientation is different. The relationship to the self is different. In the morning, the first half, the movement is outward. You build, you establish, you construct a persona and use it to create a place in the world. And that is legitimate and necessary work. But in the afternoon, the second half, the movement goes inward. It doesn't mean withdrawal from the world, but a different relationship to it. And the question shifts from what can I achieve to what is actually mine? And from how do I perform to who is performing? Who is the performer? And this is the question AI disruption is forcing, whether people are ready for it or not. When the professional identity that anchored the first half of life begins to lose its stability, the psyche does not simply wait for a new role to fill the gap. It just begins to ask the second half question. And the human essence in the AI age question is not new. It is actually ancient. But what is new is the external pressure making it impossible to defer. For decades, the career provided enough identity structure that the deeper question could be postponed. But AI is removing that option. And in doing so, however uncomfortably, it is doing something the second half of life was always going to demand anyway. And what I see consistently in the people I work with, after 25 years sitting with these questions personally, and more than 3 years watching others navigate them, is that the ones who reframe this moment move differently. The ones who stop treating the persona collapse as a problem to be solved and start treating it as information. Not faster, not with more certainty, but with a kind of groundedness that the persona, for all its usefulness, never actually provided. So let me state the argument plainly, and then I'll leave you with it. AI is dismantling the persona structure that midlife professionals build their sense of self around. And that dismantling is the external catalyst for the internal process Jung called individuation. It's the one human process that is structurally beyond what AI can replicate. And Nietzsche's parallel holds. The person asking, who do I need to become for the market, is asking the last man's question. But the person asking, who am I, beneath the role I have been performing, is asking the question the second half of life has always required. And the answer to that question, worked out honestly over time, produces something no algorithm can produce. A self that is genuinely, that is specifically, and that is irreducibly yours. Again, I did not create the question. It just made it impossible to keep ignoring. And the self that emerges on the other side of it, that is yours in a way the persona never was. So if this framing makes sense of something you've been experiencing, or if the idea that AI disruption might be functioning as an involuntary catalyst of individuation resonates, the next step is understanding what individuation actually looks like as a practice. Not as a concept, not as an idea, not as something you read, but as something you do. And that's something the next video addresses. The shadow and why the parts of yourself you've been avoiding are precisely the parts the second half of life requires. So make sure to subscribe, and if you have thoughts or pushbacks on the Jung-Nietzsche convergence here, I would honestly like to read it in the comments below. Thanks and goodbye.